A great change is happening in Germany in the next months, in the next days. Angela Merkel is leaving after almost 16 years the German politics. And her continuity candidate, the centrist conservative Armin Laschet, has beaten one of her longest-standing rivals in the contest to lead Germany's Christian Democratic Union. We have with us to discuss the impact of the change in German politics Dr. Jens Bastian, a German that lives in Greece for many years. Dr. Bastian, I want to welcome you in this ELIAMEP podcast and thank you for having this discussion with us. Dr. Bastian, I want to ask you how and why did Laschet won the CDU leadership race? How did he do it?
I think it is important to put his victory in context. Armin Laschet is a 59-year-old man. He is the governor, or as we say in Germany, the prime minister, of the single largest state of North Rhine-Westphalia, the single largest state in Germany. It is the most populous state. It has considerable manufacturing industry. It is a state making a transition from coal to clean energy. And he governs there in a coalition with the Free Democrats in the capital city, Düsseldorf. Now, when he won the leadership election, actually had to be rescheduled twice in 2020 because it was held in the shadow of the coronavirus pandemic. And it was the first digital party leadership election that any party in Germany has ever carried out. And from a technical perspective, it went without a major glitch. There were, for example, some concerns that maybe there could be a hacking intervention that would disrupt the voting procedure. None of that took place. But we have to highlight the following facts. The outcome was close. Laschet received 52.6% of the vote from the delegates and his closest rival, Friedrich Merz, 47.4%. That means that you have two competing political currents and also groups of expectations among delegates, voters, and members of the CDU. And one of the major tasks of Mr. Laschet, and it is a very large challenge, will be, can you bring together these two competing political currents in the CDU? One that is more in the direction of Mr. Laschet, in the sense of very pro-European, also very much in the tradition of Chancellor Merkel, against what Friedrich Merz, the losing candidate, signified to be more of a conservative, back to the original Christian values of the CDU, which many delegates embraced, but at the end of the day, it wasn't enough to win the leadership contest.
What do you believe, Dr. Bastian, will be the implication for the other parties, for the Social Democrats, the Greens, the Alternative für Deutschland, and the Liberals? I mean, Laschet is pro-European, and he's also in the center of the German politics. So will that affect CDU? Will some of the voters that are to the right go to the AfD? How will be affected by Laschet?
The first aspect to consider here is that the leadership election was actually the second attempt of the Christian Democrats to initiate the post-Merkel era in German politics. The first attempt failed when Mrs. Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, often abbreviated in Germany as AKK, Mrs. Kramp-Karrenbauer, she was Merkel's handpicked successor, and she took over as party chief in 2018. Slightly over a year later, she resigned her position as party leader after a string of defeats for the CDU in regional elections. The important thing here to bear in mind for the Christian Democrats is that her resignation holds an important lesson for her successor today, Mr. Laschet. Mrs. Kramp-Karrenbauer had a major problem that she was, as a member of the cabinet, because she still is the German defense minister, she was continuously overshadowed by Chancellor Merkel. And Mr. Laschet, who is not a member of Merkel's cabinet in the federal government, he now faces a similar challenge, namely, how quickly and how convincingly can he step out of the shadow of Mrs. Merkel and define his own profile, his own political agenda. So much for the Christian Democrats. As regards the other parties that you asked, one overriding aspect to bear in mind is the following. Like in other European countries, and Germany is no outlier there, the German party system is very much in flux. Equally, the voting preferences. There are many voters today who in Germany vote one party, and at the next opportunity they will vote for another party. Hence, party loyalty is something that cannot be taken for granted anymore. This particularly affects the two major leading parties in Germany, the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, abbreviated the SPD. They are both struggling to continue being labeled what we call in German Volksparteien, which means parties that have a big enough tent to embrace different constituencies of voters and keep them in that tent. This tent is shrinking very much, and today both the CDU and the SPD, who would have in the past received a combined majority of 70 or sometimes even 80% plus, they can be happy if they achieve maybe 40% plus. That's about how much is in flux in the German party political system. As regards the Greens, they are in many ways the party that is trying to replace the CDU and the SPD as a new big tent party. They are rising in opinion polls. They are represented in government across many states in Germany, in different coalitions with Social Democrats or even with the Christian Democrats, and they are preparing for government at the federal level. It will be important, can the Greens possibly come, they will be stronger than the SPD, that is without a doubt, but how close can they come to match the vote of the CDU or possibly even overtake them? That would be a political earthquake in Germany. Finally, with regard to two smaller parties, the AfD faces the major political challenge. Can it repeat its impressive result, over 10% from 2017 in the forthcoming elections in September of this year? Can the AfD possibly benefit from voters who, for example, doubt the severity of the pandemic in Germany, who are reluctant to be vaccinated, and who criticize the federal government, regional governments for repeated lockdown measures? As regards the Liberal Democrats, or Free Democrats as they are called in Germany, and abbreviated FDP, for them the election of Mr. Laschet is actually an opportunity to highlight. They are in coalition with Mr. Laschet in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, and they hope that such a coalition could be an attractive alternative following the federal elections in September of this year.
Do you believe that Laschet will be the chancellor candidate for CDU?
He definitely is in pole position to become the chancellor of not only the CDU, but it also has a Bavarian sister party, the Christian Social Union, the so-called CSU. Both parties who form a joint caucus in the German Bundestag in Berlin, they have agreed to decide who will be the chancellor candidate in April of this year. In my view, Mr. Laschet, he has the momentum of victory. And he could lay any speculation who should be the candidate among the conservative caucus, he could lay that speculation to rest by quickly and clearly claiming the candidacy for himself. He has not done so yet, he's waiting. There is a Bavarian wild card running for chancellor candidate. That is the Bavarian state governor, Markus Söder. And Berlin is rife with speculation that Mr. Söder, who is running high in the opinion polls, could be the better joint candidate in terms of popularity and the capacity to reach a larger constituency of voters. It remains to be seen. It's a two-horse race right now, and both candidates will await the outcome of regional elections that are taking place in 2 states in Germany in March of this year. And pending how well the CDU does in these 2 states, we will then have a definite answer in April.
Now, I want us to discuss a little bit how the change in Germany, how the fact that we will not have anymore Angela Merkel will affect foreign policy aspects, how it will affect the relationships with the EU, the power struggle in the EU, with Russia, China, and the United States of America, and having in mind that also in the United States we have a change. We have Joe Biden, who is going to be the next president from today. So how all this is going to affect Germany and the world?
That's the $2 million question. And indeed, as we speak, the inauguration process is to start in the United States today. The foreign policy aspects and characterization of Mr. Laschet is vague, to say the least, right now. Let me start from the European perspective. Mr. Laschet comes from the German city of Aachen. That is a city that is traditionally associated with the so-called Charlemagne Prize that is awarded to a citizen, a politician in Europe for work that he or she has done in the service of European unification. And therefore, I would argue that Mr. Laschet, given his background, his origins, his roots, he is rooted in the significance of EU affairs. In my view, he stands to continue Mrs. Merkel's pro-EU focus, without a doubt, and he will emphasize the Franco-German relationship above everything else in that EU policy affairs network. But he still also has to, in many ways, convince people that he's not only a prime minister of a state in Germany, but that he can actually also be a statesperson in European affairs. And there, some doubts remain. He's made statements with regard to industrial policy, European champions that, in particular in the steel industry, which is important in the state that he governs, that he's in favor of such European champions. But it remains to be seen how he continues to define his profile in that area. He's been loyal to Mrs. Merkel with regard to supporting her also in the European refugee and migration developments of the past years. Hence, he has also held back with regard to any kind of criticism in the pandemic policies that have been implemented in Europe, in Germany, also with regard to now the EU rules on vaccination and the acquisition of vaccines across Europe. Turning to Russia and China, Mr. Laschet's foreign policy profile is rather foggy, I would say. On Russia, Mr. Laschet appears, in my view, accommodating. He will emphasize certain projects that Mrs. Merkel has embraced with Russia to continue these. That includes the completion of the controversial Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline project with Russia. That will not necessarily please the United States and the Biden administration. Mr. Laschet, in my view, also will emphasize economic engagement with China, in particular with regard to trade partnership between Germany and China. He has, in the past weeks, endorsed the preliminary investment agreement between China and the European Union that was just finalized at the end of last year. Looking at the transatlantic view of politics, Mr. Laschet has said rather little about the United States and how he intends to approach policy making across the Atlantic. During his electoral leadership race, he made a passionate appeal to delegates this past Saturday during the digital conference, when he argued that the events of January 6th in Washington, D.C., he criticized these events very much, and I quote here from one of his statements. Beginning of quote, "Trust," Mr. Laschet said, "is what carries us and what broke in America." Continuation of the quote, "When a president polarized, sowed discord and distrust, systematically lied, he destroyed stability and trust." This is a clear statement with regard to his distance, political distance from the Trump administration, which as of now we can call former Trump administration. And it tells us something what he emphasizes: loyalty, stability, trust, overcoming polarization, and trying to identify common ground across the political aisle. And I think he will stand for that, but he needs to formulate the details of such an objective vis-à-vis the United States in the weeks and months ahead before the federal elections in Germany in September.
That is my next question to you. Which are the open issues until the general elections in September? There are a few months, a few very difficult months with the pandemic going on, with the problems with the vaccination and the vaccines. How do you see Armin Laschet dealing with all that, and which is the biggest open issues that he will have to deal till the elections in September?
The election of Mr. Laschet, and potentially also him becoming chancellor candidate, now sets up a tense few months for Germany's strongest political party ahead of the national elections. We also should bear in mind that the magnitude of change for the CDU in specific, and more generally for German politics, this magnitude of change that we are witnessing and that will continue in the coming months will actually only sink in once Mrs. Merkel leaves office. She's been chancellor for 16 plus years. These 16 years have left their mark on German politics, and legacies abound. Just to put it in perspective, as today is the inauguration of Joe Biden, Merkel's reign in Germany will have spanned 4 US presidents. Hence, what will change in the manner which Germany is governed? There are a number of X factors. First of all, after 16 years of Mrs. Merkel, a man returns to office, provided that Mr. Laschet is the candidate, or Mr. Söder from the Christian Democratic Union. And if the Greens nominate a woman, that could change with regard to the chancellor candidate and them becoming the strongest party. Much will depend in terms of the strength of the different parties about the success of the vaccine rollout in the coming months, because there is a lingering sense of expectation, but also rising frustration about the slow rollout of the vaccine. And this will impact on the standing of candidates for chancellor ahead of the elections. I've mentioned previously the outcome of various regional elections in the coming months in Germany. These regional elections will test the momentum and how voters react to Mr. Laschet as the new CDU leader. And in many ways, as Chancellor Merkel will leave the political scene in Germany, there is a risk of a leadership vacuum, not necessarily in Germany. We will have a chancellor again, whoever it is, in September. But the leadership vacuum will rather emerge in Europe. And who will fill that gap is one of the challenging, fascinating debates that we are going to have in the next months. Is it Mr. President Macron, or is it somebody else who will emerge in the coming months to fill that vacuum? Or is it not one person alone, but possibly a group of countries that will argue we have to fill this gap in Europe and with regard to European affairs vis-à-vis Russia, China, and the United States?
I want to thank you for this discussion, Dr. Bastian. We are looking ahead to difficult days and very interesting ones for that matter. And we will have to see how things evolve. I want to thank you again very much for this discussion.
I thank you for having me, and indeed, the coming months will be filled with discussion, debate, and they will be fascinating with regard to their outcome.